does your online presence impact executive search? So we've got all of these degree verifications, all of that set, but then we've got the online presence. What impact, how does that impact executive search?
Sure. Well, your social media presence is a reflection of, your values and who you are as a person. And, more and more employees and shareholders expect their leaderships of these, prominent organizations to be reflective of the values that they want to represent. So it's important that, your social media presence is reflecting the values of yourself.
Sure. And Kelly, what were your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think the prevalence of social media today can no longer be ignored, right? Disagreements that were generally a private disagreement are now public, right? And so, one of the predictors of future behavior is past behavior. So, as we look at social media and we think about the impact of your presence on executive search, you can't help but, as an executive search professional, look at that social media and think about that individual and how they're going to impact your client, right? It's very similar to an education verification. But, today, you'll see a lot of different studies that are done, but 50% of most organizations, companies out there use social media as a decision-making tool today. So, I think as we all think about our social media presence and we engage with an executive search firm or we engage with any employer, it's something we need to be aware of.
It just, you talk about, and we talked about this in our preparation, that whole separation of private and public. And it just seems like with online, there really is no private life. And so, Kelly, how does a search firm conduct this review, of a candidate's online presence? The pros and the cons, especially when you have like a high-profile thought leader who is, talking a lot, followed a lot, commenting a lot.
Yeah. Well, let me first go back to your last comment. We all choose to be on social media. It's a choice. And so, I would caution anyone who makes a choice to always think about the choice they make, right? In social media, it's a choice. But in terms of how an organization, how a researcher internally goes about this, it starts with something as simple as a Google search, and what pops up in a Google search, everything from an article about you, your comments on Twitter, to your social media Facebook page or your Instagram page. And so what we look at early on are some of those red flags, right? Are we going to move someone forward? If we see Twitter pop up with maybe some very negative comments, or maybe not negative, someone could just be maybe very boisterous about a particular topic. But again, going back to Lindsay's comment about your values, maybe your client's values, right? These are things we're considering in this process. But I would say Google is one of our best tools because it opens up, the door to so many different social media sites. So to anyone on this webinar today, what I would say is Google yourself. That's your first step, right? And you're going to look at the first 2 pages because that's what I'm going to look at in an executive search firm, and do these pages really represent you? Is this who you are? Is this who you want people, outside of your work environment or family environment to see you as? So, I think that's how we look at it. We think about our client, we think about our client's values, and certainly what your values are. And those are all factors when we are researching an individual for the executive search process.
Thank you. That is incredibly insightful, particularly using Google. I bet everyone's out there doing that right now. So how this is for you, Lindsay, and Peter, I definitely would like your feedback on this as well, but how do generational factors impact an executive social media presence? We're talking millennials, who have grown up online, and Gen Zs, by the way, who've grown up online and might have more of their life documented, like teenage years and so on. What would you say are the different concerns for candidates of different generations? And then how is the next generation's broader view, broader online presence viewed, rather? So you've got this whole multi-generational workforce now. What are your thoughts there?
Well, that's a really big question. There's Edelman PR does this really great study every year. It's called the Edelman Trust Barometer. They've been conducting this study for 20 years, so they now have a significant amount of research, and they have seen how trust has evolved. From a business perspective, political perspective, and their recent study has shown that trust is deteriorating between people in the media and politicians, but it's actually increasing between employees and their employers. And many employees now are often choosing their employer based on their stances on particular social issues, and employees expect regular and truthful communication between, from their C-suite executives and from their leaders. There's an expectation that CEOs be personally visible as a representative of the brand's values, both internally and externally. So, as a leader and as somebody, as an executive who wants to be in a leadership role, it's important to your employees that you are representing the values that they hold dear to the organization, and that's the reason that they're employed there. So I think that just seeing how that has evolved over the course of the last 20 years is really interesting, and I will pass it over to Peter to comment further on the generational gap, which I think is a really interesting comment. And
this question has many subparts.
Right. Thanks, Lindsay. Those are great points. I don't even know what generation I'm in. I'm getting in an older one over time. That's all spot on. And I think, look, there from a practical standpoint, there are more, of course, more and more social media sites popping up over time, and people are using social media in different ways. In particular, the so-called younger generations. For example, when we're looking at candidates in academia, let's say it's a head of school search or a university president search, one focus we might have is to focus on Instagram. There are a lot of campuses, especially in the US, have sort of grassroots movements where diverse students, create an Instagram account. It could be Black at Harvard or something like that, and they'll share their experiences of what it's like to be on the Harvard campus, and it could be general comments, or it could even name a particular person. Say, like, I had a horrible experience with this dean, and that might be the candidate. And it's so we as researchers have to really stay on our toes to to anticipate what the next wave of like this is going to be that we're going to have to find, because it's often hard to predict given the speed of these developments and the technology that is associated with them.
Yes, it's that is quite compelling. What advice would you give to a candidate, Kelly, for identifying these issues early on, so early in the process?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, 50% of hiring managers, right, are looking at social media. So, what I would say is cleaning up your social media image doesn't mean you have to change who you are, right? You just have to put out a more, I guess I would say, polished version. I would start with making your accounts private. Even when I hire someone, I will Google them. If I see their accounts are open, I'm going to dig through them. So I would advise definitely locking down your accounts for sure, and maybe only accept friend requests from those right? Not those you don't, because then your brand kind of travels even further without your consent. And then take a conservative approach. If you're going to comment on something, or if you previously commented on something and you're questioning it now, remove it, right? Always taking a conservative approach. Anything that makes you kind of think twice, act on it, remove it, or don't do it. Peter mentioned earlier deactivating old accounts. I don't know if you want to revisit, your teenage years, your early 20s. I don't. Luckily, mine aren't online, so I'm fortunate in that regard. But just something I would absolutely think about. And I'd also think about the photos you put out there, the photos that project you, your behavior, what you do, what you may consider, not risky behavior, someone else might. So, sometimes I would say put yourself in someone else's shoes just to kind of, think from a different point of view of how someone else might see you. And literally, what I would say is if there's anything out there you can't remove, you can't control, always have a reason, always have a way to position it. And I would always say, mention it first before someone else finds it, because the anxiety and those feelings you probably get knowing something like that would be uncovered. It's much better to kind of put it out there in the open before someone, discovers it before you.
Certainly.
So, there's no right or wrong. Those of us older on this call are much more at an advantage, right? Because we didn't grow up with social media. And it'll be interesting to see, say, in 20, 30 years, what it looks like when everybody grows up on social media. And maybe it'll be perceived differently. It'll just be for time to tell.
It's sort of like it will be the norm to have all of these things out there. And it sounds like, awareness. If you have awareness, it will help you be more proactive with your social media, but you have to know what's out there to be proactive.
You got to Google yourself first. That's
Google yourself.
First step. Yeah.
So Simeon, I'd love to hear your perspective on the advice you would give to a candidate, given your role on the team that you lead, global team in career services, executive career services.
Yeah, this is a really big topic for some and not so much for others. So I have many clients, BlueSteps clients, who say, I've never been to social media. I'm very paranoid about what's on there about me, so I never touch it. So for those who are in that camp, I usually do suggest that you have some sort of social media presence, because the more senior you are, the more point of view you want to get out there, right? As being a bit of a thought leader, right? That's kind of what differentiates you from another executive. On the other spectrum are people that we're talking about here, which, they may or may not recognize that some of the things that they have done in the past online, et cetera, or even through their family accounts, are traceable through them. And they haven't, we start our coaching sessions together and they haven't even started that first step. And so as we Google their names, a lot of things come out. So it really depends on what it is that comes up. Obviously, as all the professionals on this call are commenting the same thing. For me, it's always been about transparency and as we say here, trust, right? So everyone's got a past, and I think hiring managers, myself, I know we all like, things that in our life, but the reality is that if you are constantly evolving that, as far as putting out if you can't control certain documents or things that are in the past because they belong to another document, as Peter is saying, etc., I think starting to be more proactive about being positive, right, about your own image, being positive about how you view business, being positive about the view of the future, even if it means like once every 2 weeks on LinkedIn posting a couple of paragraphs, right, of things that you just start to establish yourself as an expert in something else, right, other than your past. And so what I often say is, it's not sort of a hand wave kind of approach, but it's really if you move your hand more this way, people are going to tend to look towards here, right? But in reality, many things you can't deactivate, or you don't even know they still exist. And so, and I think as Kelly was mentioning earlier, honesty being the best policy is that, you would try to address that up front, right? And that happens in different ways. That might happen sometimes in executive biography or an executive summary, where you're not saying that, I've had these photos, but you might say, I've lived an exciting life, right? I'm a thrill seeker, right? And you kind of address it that way, where you're already coaching kind of for yourself a bit of a personality, and you want to make people like working with you, right? That's at the end of the day. And so there's a bit of a balance there between showing some personality beyond the workforce and then also showing professionalism. So, I have a client right now who was in a legal situation and was laid off with severance, but then the owner realized that there was severance, so changed that sort of layoff policy, saying that there was with cause. And so he got into the news, and now he's on these different. If you Google his name, you'll see him. And I didn't realize that when I first started working with him until I Googled him afterwards, and it's like, wow, okay, so he's actually in an active legal place right there. So the idea of working with a Mints group and sort of thinking about career coaching and how do you start steering your job search strategy based on the fact that that might still be there, is very challenging. And so our coaches and our team are really great at kind of working through that with our clients. So hopefully that helps.